I agreed to the cabin trip because I thought it would finally help me get over Carter. That was the whole reason. 5 days in the mountains with my closest friends sounded like the perfect distraction. No dating apps, no crowded bars, no awkward situations where I had to pretend I wasn't staring at my best friend every time he took his shirt off. Just fresh air, beer, hiking trails, and a bunch of idiots yelling over card games. At least, that's what I told myself. The group was the usual disaster lineup. Me, Carter, Dax, Miles, Bennett, Beckett. 6 guys packed into one cabin deep in the woods for a long weekend. And one secret that I was absolutely determined to take to the grave. The drive up already felt chaotic. Dax kept changing the music every 30 seconds. Miles complained about the lack of phone signal before we'd even left the city. And Bennett nearly caused a crash trying to pass Carter a breakfast sandwich from the back seat. Meanwhile, Carter sat beside me in the passenger seat, looking unfairly good in a dark hoodie and backwards cap, one knee bouncing while he scrolled through playlists on his phone. "You're weirdly quiet today," he said casually. I kept my eyes on the road. "I'm driving. You can still talk while driving. Not with Dax screaming in the back." "I heard that," Dax yelled immediately. Carter laughed under his breath. That laugh always got me. Low and easy. Familiar in the worst possible way. I'd known him for 4 years, and somehow my feelings had only gotten worse. He was one of those guys who acted naturally affectionate with everyone. Arm around your shoulders, leaning against you while laughing, random late-night talks that felt way too intimate for friendship. Most people thought Carter was just friendly. I knew better. Or maybe I didn't. That was the problem. Because sometimes he'd look at me a little too long. Sometimes his voice dropped softer around me. Sometimes I caught him staring when he thought I wasn't paying attention. Then he mentioned some girl from work, and I'd feel stupid all over again. By the time we reached the cabin, the sun was already starting to set behind the trees. The place looked straight out of a horror movie. Massive wooden cabin, huge windows, dense forest surrounding us on all sides. A lake maybe 50 yards away reflecting orange light through the trees. Dax whistled. "Okay, this is actually sick." Bennett grabbed the cooler from the trunk. "Dibs on the biggest room." "You're one person," Miles said. "Exactly. I deserve space." Carter stretched beside the car, hoodie lifting just enough to expose his stomach for half a second. I immediately looked away, which apparently didn't go unnoticed. Carter smirked slightly. "You good?" "Fine." "You look scared." "I'm scared of your fashion choices." "Wow." He shoved my shoulder lightly while grinning, and somehow even that tiny touch messed with my head. Inside, the cabin was surprisingly nice. Stone fireplace, huge kitchen, upstairs loft with extra beds. The whole place smelled like cedar and cold air. The sleeping arrangements immediately became a fight. "There are only 4 actual beds," Miles announced after checking upstairs. Dax pointed at me instantly. "Alex and Carter can share. They basically act married anyway." My stomach dropped. Carter laughed. "True. Nobody noticed how quiet I got after that." The room Carter and I ended up with was small but cozy. One queen bed against the wall, tiny lamp, window overlooking the lake. I stared at the mattress. Carter tossed his bag down casually. "You snore?" "No." "Cool. Me either." He said it like sharing a bed with me was the most normal thing in the world. Meanwhile, my brain was already planning ways to survive 4 nights without completely losing my mind. The first night started innocent enough. We grilled burgers outside while Dax nearly burned the buns. Bennett got drunk way too fast. Miles kept trying to start ghost stories. Beckett barely talked, which wasn't unusual. He was quieter than the rest of us, more observant, the kind of guy who noticed things other people missed. At one point, I caught him looking at me and Carter across the fire with a strange expression. Then he looked away. Around midnight, everyone moved inside for cards and drinks. Carter sat beside me on the couch, one leg pressed against mine. He didn't move it. Neither did I. Bennett slammed cards down dramatically. "Truth or dare?" Miles groaned immediately. "We're not 16. Yes, we are emotionally." Dax pointed at Carter. "Truth or dare?" "Truth." "Boring." "Fine. Biggest secret you've never told anyone." The room exploded with reactions. Oh, that's actually good. Carter leaned back against the couch, looking amused. Damn, starting strong. I focused very hard on my drink, because if anyone asked me that question, the entire trip would be over. Carter thought for a second before shrugging. I almost got involved with someone in college and panicked at the last second. Bennett blinked. That's your huge secret? Pretty much. Dax narrowed his eyes. Wait, someone? Carter smirked. That's all you get. The conversation moved on quickly after that, but my chest stayed tight. Someone. Something about the way he'd answered felt strange, like there was more he wasn't saying. An hour later, Bennett was fully drunk. Dax was arguing with Miles about aliens, and Beckett had disappeared upstairs. Carter nudged my knee gently. Come outside with me. I followed him onto the back porch without thinking. Cold night air hit instantly. The lake looked black under the moonlight, trees swaying softly around us. Carter leaned against the railing beside me. Needed a break from those idiots. Fair. For a minute, neither of us spoke. Then Carter glanced over. You've been acting weird lately. I forced a laugh. You say that every week. No, seriously. His voice softened. You seem distant. That caught me off guard, because he sounded like he actually cared. I'm fine. You sure? The porch light cast shadows across his, and suddenly he looked way too close, way too warm. I swallowed hard. Yeah. Carter kept staring at me for another second before nodding slowly. Then he smiled faintly. Good. Didn't want this trip to be miserable. God, that smile ruined me. Before I could answer, the cabin door slid open behind us. Beckett stepped outside holding a beer. His eyes moved between me and Carter, and for some reason, the look on his face made my stomach twist. Because it didn't look surprised. It looked knowing. And deep down, I had a horrible feeling my secret wasn't as hidden as I thought it was. I barely slept that night. Not because of the cabin noises or Dax snoring loud enough to shake the walls downstairs. Because Carter was next to me, actually next to me. The bed was barely big enough for two grown men, and every movement made us brush against each other somehow. His arm, his knee, the heat from his body under the blankets. It was torture. At some point, around 3 o'clock in the morning, I woke up half disoriented and realized Carter had rolled closer in his sleep. His arm was draped across my waist. My entire body froze. I stared into the darkness, heart pounding like an idiot, while his breathing stayed slow and steady against the back of my neck. It probably meant nothing. That was the dangerous part about Carter. Everything he did could mean nothing. Still, I didn't move. I hated myself a little for that. The next morning was chaos almost immediately. Bennett burned bacon. Dax complained about the shower pressure. Miles found a spider the size of his hand and nearly died dramatically in the kitchen. Meanwhile, Carter stood beside me making coffee in gray sweatpants and a black t-shirt, like he was personally sent to ruin my life. You look tired, he said. I rubbed my eyes. Didn't sleep great. Carter smirked slightly. You kept moving around. My face got warm instantly. Sorry, I didn't say I minded. He said it casually before taking a sip of coffee, but my brain still short-circuited over it. Across the kitchen, Beckett watched us silently. Again, that same strange expression. By noon, Dax forced everyone into hiking plans. It's criminal to come all the way out here and stay inside. Bennett groaned dramatically from the couch. I came here to drink and emotionally collapse. You can do that in nature. So, an hour later, we were walking through forest trails surrounded by massive pine trees and cold mountain air. Carter stayed beside me most of the hike. Not unusual. That's what I kept telling myself. Still, every little thing felt loaded now. His shoulder brushing mine. His hand briefly grabbing my hoodie when the trail got steep. The way he kept smiling at me like we had some private joke no one else understood. At one point, Dax and Miles walked ahead, arguing about whether they could survive in the wilderness. Bennett disappeared behind us to pee, which somehow left me and Carter alone for a few minutes. The silence between us felt oddly comfortable. Carter kicked a rock off the trail. You ever think about moving somewhere like this? Middle of nowhere? Yeah, you'd lose your mind after 2 days. He laughed. Probably. Then quieter. Still sounds peaceful, though. I glanced over at him. Something about his mood felt different this trip. Softer somehow. More thoughtful. Before I could say anything, Carter suddenly looked at me. Can I ask you something? Depends. You ever had feelings for someone you definitely shouldn't? My chest tightened instantly. Dangerously. I forced a shrug. Probably. Carter looked ahead again. Yeah, that was it. No explanation, no joke afterward. Just that one quiet answer hanging in the air between us. The rest of the hike blurred after that, because my brain kept replaying his words over and over. Feelings for someone you shouldn't. By the time we got back to the cabin, tension sat heavy in my chest. And apparently, I wasn't the only one noticing weird energy. That night after dinner, Beckett cornered me in the kitchen while everyone else argued over movies in the living room. "You okay?" he asked quietly. I looked up from the sink. "Yeah, you sure?" Why did everyone suddenly want emotional updates from me? "I'm fine, Beckett." He leaned against the counter, lowering his voice further. "You know Carter likes you, right?" Every muscle in my body locked up. "What?" Beckett looked almost annoyed. "Alex, come on." I stared at him. Actually stared. Because hearing someone else say it out loud felt impossible. "He doesn't," I managed. Beckett raised an eyebrow. "You seriously can't tell?" My pulse was pounding now. He's not. "Straight?" Beckett finished. I went silent. Beckett sighed softly. "I'm not trying to start drama. I just figured somebody should say it." "How would you even know?" "Because I've watched him stare at you for 2 years. Jesus Christ." I looked toward the living room instinctively. Carter was laughing at something Dax said, head tilted back slightly. Completely normal. Completely impossible to read. Beckett crossed his arms. "You're telling me you never noticed?" I thought I swallowed hard. I thought maybe I was imagining things. "You weren't." The room suddenly felt too warm. Because if Beckett was right, then what the hell had I been doing all this time? And worse, what if Carter actually knew how I felt too? Before I could think further, footsteps approached. Carter walked into the kitchen, grabbing another beer from the fridge. His eyes moved between us immediately. "You guys plotting murder in here?" Beckett smirked faintly. "Something like that." Carter looked at me. "You good?" I nodded too quickly. "Yeah." Beckett gave me one last meaningful look before walking away, leaving me completely alone with Carter. Worst possible scenario. Carter leaned against the counter beside me, close enough that our arms touched. "You look stressed." "I'm not." "Liar." His voice came softer this time, gentler. I could feel him watching me. "Alex." The way he said my name made my stomach twist. I finally looked up at him. Big mistake. Because Carter was already staring at me with this unreadable expression that made my entire chest feel tight. "What?" I asked quietly. For a second, he didn't answer. Then, nothing. But he kept looking at me anyway. And suddenly, the space between us felt dangerously small. A crash sounded from the living room, followed by Dax screaming. "Bennett, you." Carter laughed under his breath and stepped back. The moment snapped instantly, but not before I noticed something. His face looked slightly flushed, and when he walked away, he avoided looking at me again. That should have been the point where I realized this trip was about to change everything. But honestly, the real disaster started later that night when I found out I wasn't the only one in that cabin hiding a secret. It happened after midnight. Of course it did. Everything bad always happens after midnight. We'd spent the evening drinking, playing stupid games, and arguing over horror movies. Dax got progressively louder with every beer. Bennett passed out on the couch halfway through the second movie with chips all over his chest. Miles kept pretending he wasn't scared while jumping at every loud sound. And Carter barely left my side all night. Not obviously, just little things. Sitting beside me again, hand brushing my knee when he reached for snacks. Leaning closer whenever he talked to me, even though the room wasn't loud enough to need it. At one point, I caught Beckett watching us from across the room again, like he was waiting for something. Around 1 o'clock in the morning, Miles announced he was going to bed. Dax followed after another beer. Bennett was already unconscious, which somehow left me, Carter, and Beckett downstairs alone. Beckett stretched slowly from the recliner. I'm turning in too. Then he looked directly at me before heading upstairs. That left just me and Carter. The cabin suddenly felt quieter. Too quiet. Carter muted the TV and leaned back into the couch cushions with a sigh. "You tired?" "A little." "You don't have to stay up because of me." "I know." Neither of us moved. The fire crackled softly beside us. Outside, wind rattled faintly through the trees. Carter turned toward me slightly. "Can I ask you something else?" I laughed nervously. "You ask a lot of dangerous questions." "That's not an answer." I stared down at my drink. "Fine, ask." For a second, Carter looked strangely nervous. Then, have you ever almost told someone something and stopped because you were scared it would ruin everything? My heart started pounding immediately. There it was again, that weird tension underneath his words. I swallowed hard. Yeah, Carter nodded slowly, like that answer mattered more than it should have. Then he looked at me, really looked at me, and suddenly I couldn't breathe properly, because there was something different in his face now, something raw, uncertain. I think about it all the time, he admitted quietly. My throat felt dry instantly. About what? Carter opened his mouth, then froze. Footsteps creaked upstairs. A second later, Dax yelled from the loft, "Why is there a bathtub in the middle of the hallway?" The moment shattered immediately. Carter groaned loudly, throwing his head back against the couch. I laughed before I could stop myself. "Your timing is cursed," he muttered. "What were you going to say?" Carter looked back at me. For one dangerous second, I thought he might actually tell me. Instead, he smirked weakly. Nothing important. Coward. But honestly, I was one too, because part of me wanted to grab him and force the truth out of him. And the other part was terrified I already knew it. Eventually, we headed upstairs. The hallway lights were dim, shadows stretching across the wooden floor. Carter walked beside me quietly. Then right before we reached our room, he suddenly caught my wrist lightly. I stopped breathing. What? His fingers loosened immediately, like he hadn't even realized he touched me. "Sorry," he said softly, but he didn't move away. Neither did I. We were standing stupidly close now, close enough that I could see the tiredness in his eyes, the faint flush in his cheeks, the way his chest rose slightly faster than normal. The air felt heavy, and then a floorboard creaked nearby. We both jumped apart instantly. Beckett stood at the end of the hallway holding a glass of water, his expression unreadable, but he definitely saw us. Carter cleared his throat quickly. Good night." Beckett nodded slowly without speaking. I went into the bedroom feeling like my entire nervous system was on fire. Carter came in a minute later, quieter than usual. Neither of us said much while getting ready for bed. I changed facing the wall, mostly because I didn't trust myself anymore. The silence between us wasn't awkward exactly. It was worse. Charged. I climbed into bed first while Carter turned off the lamp. Darkness swallowed the room. For a while, all I could hear was the sound of his breathing beside me. Then softly, "Alex? Yeah? You know I'd never do anything to hurt you, right?" The question hit me completely off guard. I turned slightly toward him in the dark. "What?" "I mean it." His voice sounded serious now, almost vulnerable. "You're one of the most important people in my life." Jesus Christ. I stared into the darkness, trying to process that. "Carter, I just needed you to know that." I should have said something meaningful. Instead, I whispered, "Okay, brilliant work, Alex." A few quiet seconds passed. Then Carter shifted closer under the blankets. Not enough to be obvious. Just enough that I could feel his warmth. My entire body was hyper-aware of him now. Every movement, every breath. At some point, I must have fallen asleep despite the chaos in my head, because the next thing I knew, I was waking up disoriented in the middle of the night. The room was pitch black, and Carter was pressed against me. Not accidentally, not vaguely close. Actually pressed against me. One arm wrapped tightly around my waist, his face buried against the back of my neck. My heart nearly stopped. For a second, I couldn't move, could barely think, because this wasn't normal. This wasn't casual Carter behavior. And then I felt it. Something hard against my lower back. A sharp breath caught in my throat instantly. Carter froze behind me. Completely froze. Neither of us moved, neither of us spoke. The silence became unbearable. Then finally, very quietly, "Alex." His voice sounded wrecked. I swallowed hard. "Yeah?" Another long pause. And then Carter whispered the words that changed everything. "I don't think I'm straight." I genuinely thought I was still dreaming. That had to be it, because there was no way Carter was wrapped around me in the dark, whispering that into my neck like this was real life. My pulse hammered painfully against my ribs. Behind me, Carter sounded panicked by his own words. He whispered quietly, "I didn't mean to say that out loud." But he didn't let go of me. That was the part destroying my brain. I forced myself to breathe. "Carter, I know." His voice cracked slightly. "I know this is insane." The room felt too small, too hot. I turned slowly in his arms until we were facing each other. Moonlight barely filtered through the curtains, but I could still make out his expression. Terrified. Actually terrified. And weirdly relieved at the same time. Neither of us spoke for a second. Then Carter laughed weakly under his breath. You know what's embarrassing? I planned this whole trip trying not to tell you. My chest tightened instantly. What? His eyes flicked away from mine. I thought maybe if I ignored it long enough it would go away. Carter. I tried, Alex. Hearing him sound this vulnerable nearly killed me. Because Carter was never vulnerable. He was confident, relaxed, always in control. But right now, he looked completely undone. All those girls you dated, I started quietly. Carter gave a hollow laugh. Yeah, about that. The answer hit harder than it should have. Oh my God. I like some of them, he admitted. At least I think I did. But it never felt... He hesitated. Not like this. The way he said this made my entire stomach flip. I stared at him. Actually stared. For years. For years of hiding every feeling I had because I thought this could never happen. And now he was lying inches away from me, looking at me like he was scared I'd disappear. You could have told me, I whispered. Carter smiled sadly. Could you? That shut me up instantly. Because no. Absolutely not. I'd spent years terrified of ruining our friendship. Carter exhaled slowly. The worst part is, I think Beckett figured it out before I did. I almost laughed from sheer emotional exhaustion. That explains the staring. Yeah. Silence settled again. Not awkward, just overwhelming. Then Carter looked at me carefully. Say something. I swallowed hard. There's something I should probably tell you too. His entire body tensed. I could literally feel it. Okay, he said softly. God. There was no taking this back once I said it. But honestly, I was already too far gone. I've been in love with you for almost 2 years. The words hung in the darkness between us. Carter blinked once, then again. You're kidding. I shook my head slowly. And suddenly Carter looked genuinely offended. Alex. What? You let me suffer alone with this for 2 years? Despite everything, I snorted. You want to talk. That's fair. He was smiling now. Actually smiling. And seeing that expression after years of wanting this almost hurt. Carter looked down briefly before speaking again, quieter this time. I thought you'd freak out. I thought you were straight. Honestly, so did I. That pulled another laugh out of me, a nervous one this time, because the reality of this situation was finally crashing down all at once. Carter noticed immediately. Hey, his hand slid carefully against my arm. You okay? That question nearly broke me, because somehow he was still more worried about me than himself. I know, I admitted honestly. Carter nodded slowly. Yeah, same. Another long silence. Then, softly, I really want to kiss you right now. Every thought in my brain disappeared instantly. Carter's eyes searched mine carefully, like he was waiting for me to panic. Instead, I whispered, then do it. The second the words left my mouth, Carter moved, fast. One hand cupped my face while he kissed me like he'd been holding himself back forever. And maybe he had. The kiss hit me so hard emotionally, it almost felt unreal. Warm, messy, desperate in the worst way. I kissed him back immediately, fingers gripping his shirt while my entire body shook from adrenaline. Carter made this quiet sound against my mouth that nearly destroyed me. Then, suddenly he pulled back, breathing hard. Oh my God, he whispered. I could barely think straight. Yeah. His forehead rested against mine. I've wanted to do that for so long. My chest physically hurt hearing that. I laughed shakily. You have terrible timing. We're sharing a bed in a cabin together. I think my timing's incredible. That made me laugh harder. Then Carter kissed me again, slower this time, like he was trying to memorize me. And honestly, that somehow felt even more intense. At some point, his hands slid against my waist under the blankets, pulling me closer. I could feel how nervous he was despite everything, the slight shaking in his breathing, the hesitation every time he touched me somewhere new. It made this feel weirdly real, not fantasy, not drunken chaos, real. Then suddenly, a loud crash echoed downstairs. Both of us jumped violently apart. What the hell was that? Dax yelled somewhere upstairs. Bennett shouted back incoherently. Carter buried his face into the pillow, groaning. I hate everyone. I was laughing too hard to breathe properly now. A second later came another noise downstairs, followed by Miles screaming. Why is there a raccoon in the kitchen? Carter looked at me. I looked at him. And then we completely lost it laughing. Like full, uncontrollable laughing into pillows at 3 o'clock in the morning while a raccoon apparently destroyed the cabin downstairs. Eventually, the chaos faded. The cabin quieted again. And somehow, we ended up curled back toward each other in the darkness. Different now. Everything different now. Carter brushed his thumb lightly against my wrist. So, what happens tomorrow? Good question. Because 6 hours ago, he was my straight best friend. Now he was lying in bed with swollen lips from kissing me. I exhaled slowly. I have absolutely no idea. Carter smiled faintly in the dark. Cool. Then, after a pause, can we keep doing this though? My heart nearly stopped again. I moved closer without answering. Carter understood anyway. And sometime just before sunrise, I fell asleep in his arms while the storm outside rattled softly through the trees around the cabin. Waking up beside Carter should have felt awkward. Instead, it felt dangerously natural. That was the problem. Morning light spilled softly through the curtains. The room still cold from the storm outside. Carter was half asleep beside me, hair messy, one arm lazily draped across my stomach like he'd been holding me there all night, which apparently he had. I stared at the ceiling for a second, trying to process reality. Then Carter shifted closer and buried his face against my shoulder with a tired groan. "Don't move," he mumbled. I laughed quietly. People are going to wonder where we died. Worth it. My heart did something genuinely pathetic hearing that. A few seconds later, his eyes finally opened. There was this brief moment where confusion crossed his face. Then memory hit him, and suddenly he was smiling at me. Not joking, not teasing, just smiling. "You're real," he said softly. That sentence alone almost killed me. Before I could answer, pounding footsteps thundered upstairs. Then Dax screamed through the door. "If you two are secretly seeing each other in there, I swear to God." Carter shot upright instantly. I nearly fell off the bed laughing. "Jesus Christ," Carter muttered. Dax kept yelling through the door. "Bennett made eggs, and now Miles thinks he's dying." "We need help," Bennett shouted dramatically from downstairs. Carter rubbed his face. "I hate this cabin." 5 minutes later, we finally emerged downstairs trying to act normal. Huge mistake, because apparently everyone in the room shared one collective brain cell. Miles looked between us immediately. "Why do you both look weird?" "We always look weird," Carter answered too quickly. Bennett narrowed his eyes. "Wait." Dax pointed aggressively with a spatula. "Oh my God." My stomach dropped. Carter looked calm somehow. "What? You guys totally kissed." Silence. Complete silence. I nearly choked on oxygen. Meanwhile, Carter just stared at Dax with terrifying composure. Then, "What kind of insane conclusion is that?" Dax blinked. "I don't know. Your face looks kissable." Bennett nodded seriously. "That's fair, actually." Somehow the moment dissolved into chaos before either of us had to answer. I exhaled slowly in relief. Beckett, however, was watching us over his coffee mug with the most exhausted expression imaginable, like he was witnessing idiots in a nature documentary. Later that afternoon, the weather got worse. Rain hammered the windows while wind shook the trees hard enough to make the cabin creak. Dax announced this meant forced bonding activities, which somehow turned into everyone drinking while trapped inside. By evening, things got messy fast. Bennett got emotional over a country song. Miles and Dax started wrestling on the floor. Beckett disappeared upstairs again. And Carter got touchier. Not recklessly, subtly, his hand resting against my knee under the table, fingers brushing mine when nobody looked. At one point, he leaned down near my ear while everyone argued over music. "You're smiling a lot today." Heat climbed instantly into my face. "Shut up." Carter grinned against his beer bottle. Cute, cute. That word should have been illegal. The worst part? I could tell he was getting more comfortable by the hour. Less nervous. More obvious. Which was dangerous considering we were trapped in a cabin with 4 other men and 0 privacy. Around 10 o'clock, Dax announced another round of Truth or Dare. "Absolutely not," Miles said immediately. Coward. Last time, Bennett almost kissed a lamp. It was an emotional moment. Somehow we still ended up playing, probably because alcohol lowers survival instincts. The game started harmless enough. Dumb dares, embarrassing stories. Then Dax pointed dramatically at Carter. "Truth or dare?" Carter leaned back casually. "Truth." Dax grinned. Have you ever had feelings for someone in this room? Every molecule in my body stopped functioning. Bennett yelled instantly. Oh, that's good. Miles pointed at Dax. You ask questions like a divorced woman. Carter looked calm at first. Then I noticed it. The hesitation. Small, but there. And suddenly, everyone was staring at him, waiting for an answer. Carter glanced at me, just for half a second, but Beckett noticed. Of course he did. Yeah, Carter answered finally. The room exploded immediately. Who? No way. I knew it. Dax screamed, despite definitely not knowing it. Bennett climbed onto the couch dramatically. Reveal yourself, mysterious lover. Carter laughed nervously now. Absolutely not. Dax pointed at Miles. It's Miles. Miles looked horrified. Why me? You have sad eyes. That means nothing. The conversation spiraled away from Carter eventually, but my pulse never slowed back down, because now I knew. And apparently Carter was getting reckless enough to admit it publicly. Later that night, I slipped outside onto the porch to clear my head. Rain had finally stopped, leaving cold air and dripping trees behind. The lake reflected moonlight through the darkness. I heard the door slide open behind me. Carter, of course. He stepped beside me quietly, wearing a hoodie and sweatpants. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then softly, "You okay?" I laughed under my breath. "You almost gave me a heart attack in there." Carter smiled faintly. "Sorry. You literally admitted you like someone here." I was answering honestly. "That's the problem." He leaned against the railing beside me. "I'm tired of pretending." The sincerity in his voice hit me harder than expected. Carter looked out toward the lake, jaw tightening slightly. "I spent years trying to act normal around you." My chest tightened immediately. "You know what the worst part was?" he continued quietly. "Watching you date other people." I looked over at him sharply. Carter laughed once under his breath. "Yeah, that hurt." Hearing him say that out loud felt surreal, because I'd felt the exact same way for years. Rainwater dripped softly from the roof around us. Carter finally looked back at me. "You want to know another secret?" "What?" He stepped closer, close enough that my breathing immediately changed. Then quietly, "I almost kissed you last summer." "What?" "At Dax's birthday party." Memory hit me instantly. The rooftop, too many drinks, Carter sitting way too close beside me while everyone else danced inside. At one point, we just stared at each other silently for what felt like forever. I thought I imagined that tension. Apparently not. Carter smiled weakly. I got scared. You idiot. I know. For a second, we just stood there looking at each other. Then Carter reached for my hand carefully, intertwining our fingers. Simple, small, but somehow more intimate than anything else so far. And honestly, that probably would have turned into another kiss if the cabin door hadn't suddenly slammed open behind us. Oh my God. Dax's voice. We jumped apart instantly. Dax stood frozen in the doorway, staring at our hands. Or more specifically, the fact we just let go of each other way too fast. Behind him, Bennett appeared holding chips. Then Miles. Then Beckett. Wonderful. Dax's eyes widened slowly. Well, he said, that explains a lot. Nobody spoke for a full 3 seconds, which honestly felt longer than the entire trip. Dax stood in the doorway, staring at us with the expression of a man who had just solved a murder case. Bennett slowly lowered his chips. Miles blinked twice. Wait. Carter looked beside me calmly. Way too calmly. Then he sighed. Well, this is awkward. That's your reaction? Dax exploded. You two are holding hands like a Netflix finale. I wanted the ground to swallow me whole. Bennett pointed dramatically between us. I knew something fruity was happening. You say that about everyone, Miles muttered. Because I'm usually right. Carter rubbed the back of his neck, finally looking nervous. Okay, before this becomes a whole thing... It's already a whole thing, Dax interrupted. Beckett walked out onto the porch behind them holding a beer, completely unsurprised. Of course. Miles looked between all of us slowly. Wait, how long has this been happening? My brain stopped functioning. Carter answered first. Technically? He glanced at me briefly. About 12 hours. Dax made a strangled noise. Bennett dropped onto the porch chair dramatically. This is the best trip ever. I buried my face in my hands. Carter laughed softly beside me before nudging my shoulder. Hey, he said quietly. Breathe. That somehow made everything worse, because now everyone was definitely looking at us like we were insane. Miles crossed his arms. Hold on, are you two actually together now? Silence. Carter looked at me. I looked at Carter. And weirdly, neither of us seemed scared anymore. Yeah, Carter said finally. The word hit me right in the chest. Yeah, simple as that. Dax screamed loud enough to scare birds out of nearby trees. Oh my God. Bennett looked emotional. I watched love happen. Beckett took a sip of beer. You all owe me $20. Everyone turned toward him. Miles blinked. What? Beckett shrugged calmly. I said they'd end up together before the trip ended. You bet on us? I asked, horrified. You were painfully obvious. Carter started laughing beside me. Real laughing. The kind where his whole face changed. And honestly, seeing him this happy made every ounce of panic fade away. Eventually, everyone piled back inside, immediately turning the entire situation into interrogation hour. Dax sat backwards on a chair, pointing aggressively at us. So, who fell first? Dax, I warned. No, I need timelines. Carter smirked beside me. Alex? Traitor, Bennett gasped dramatically. Oh shit. I glared at Carter while he looked entirely too pleased with himself. You literally confessed first, I argued. Yeah, after 2 years, apparently. Miles looked horrified. 2 years? Dax clutched his chest. You idiots were pining? Violently, Beckett confirmed. I hated all of them, especially because they weren't wrong. At some point, the conversation shifted into chaos again, but the energy felt different now, lighter. Nobody cared. That was the thing I hadn't let myself imagine. I'd spent years terrified this would ruin everything. Instead, Dax kept calling us cabin boyfriends, while Bennett demanded relationship updates every 10 minutes. By midnight, everyone finally started crashing upstairs. One by one, the cabin quieted. Until eventually, only me and Carter remained downstairs by the fireplace. The silence felt comfortable now, warm. Carter stretched his legs across the couch until they bumped mine. So, he said quietly. So, we survived. I smiled faintly. Barely. He looked at me for a second before his expression softened. You know what's weird? What? I don't feel panicked anymore. That surprised me. Carter leaned his head back against the couch. I thought saying this stuff out loud would destroy my life. My chest tightened quietly. Instead, it had done the opposite. I moved closer without really thinking about it. Carter immediately rested his hand against my knee. Natural. Easy. Like we'd already done this 100 times. You still okay with this? He asked softly. The fact he kept checking mattered more than he probably realized. I nodded. Yeah. Then, after a second, you? Carter looked at me for a long moment. Honestly, he admitted quietly, I think I've wanted this for longer than I realized. That sentence hit deep. The fire crackled softly nearby while wind rattled faintly outside again. Carter's fingers brushed slowly against mine. Then he smiled slightly. Can I kiss you again now that nobody's having a raccoon emergency? I laughed before leaning in first. The kiss felt different this time. Less frantic. Slower. Carter touched me carefully like he still couldn't fully believe this was real either. One of his hands slid against my waist while mine tangled lightly into his hoodie. And for the first time all trip, nothing felt complicated. No hiding, no second guessing, just Carter. Then footsteps creaked upstairs. We jumped apart instantly. Dax appeared halfway down the stairs, squinting at us. Are you guys making out? No, Carter answered immediately. Dax stared. You're literally sitting in each other's laps. I looked down. Oh, right. Carter groaned into my shoulder while Dax started cackling loud enough to wake the dead. I'm never letting this go. Please go to bed, I muttered. Dax pointed finger guns at us. Use protection, cabin boys. Then he disappeared upstairs, still laughing to himself. Carter buried his face into my neck dramatically. I'm going to kill him. I was laughing too hard to answer. But underneath all the embarrassment, something else settled quietly into my chest. Relief. Because for the first time in years, I wasn't hiding anymore, and neither was he. The next morning felt almost normal, which was insane considering 24 hours earlier, Carter was supposedly straight and I was emotionally suffering in silence. Now he was stealing bites of food off my plate while Dax gagged theatrically every time we made eye contact. Disgusting. Dax announced while pouring coffee. Love is disgusting. You cried during Toy Story 3, Miles reminded him. That was different. Carter leaned against the kitchen counter beside me, looking way too relaxed for someone who just detonated his entire identity over a cabin weekend. I still wasn't used to it. Every time he touched me casually, my brain short-circuited all over again. And he touched me constantly now. Small things. Hand on my back while passing behind me, knees pressed together under the table, absent-mindedly fixing my hood when we went outside. It felt natural to him already, which honestly made me melt a little. Around noon, the storm finally cleared enough for everyone to go down to the lake. Dax and Bennett immediately started throwing rocks at each other like children. Miles sat on the dock, complaining about the cold. Beckett stayed near the cabin reading. Meanwhile, Carter sat beside me at the edge of the water with his shoes off, jeans rolled up slightly. The lake reflected bright sunlight now, calm after 2 days of rain. For a while, we just sat there quietly. Then Carter bumped his shoulder against mine. "You've been staring at me all morning." I looked away immediately. "No, I haven't. Liar." He sounded smug about it too. I groaned. "You're becoming unbearable already. You like it." Unfortunately true. Carter leaned back on his hands, sunlight catching across his face. "You know what I keep thinking about?" "What?" "How close I came to never saying anything." That hit harder than expected. Because honestly, same. I stared out over the lake quietly. I almost skipped this trip. Carter turned toward me immediately. "Why?" I hesitated, then laughed weakly. "Because I was trying to get over you." His expression changed instantly, softer, more serious. "Alex, I thought spending more time around you was making things worse." Carter looked genuinely wrecked hearing that. He moved closer beside me until our knees touched. "I'm really sorry." "Don't be." I looked at him finally. I think it was always going to happen eventually. The corner of his mouth lifted slightly. "Yeah? Yeah." For a second, we just stared at each other again. That dangerous kind of staring, where everything else fades out. Then, Dax's voice echoed across the lake. "If you guys start making out, I'm swimming into traffic." Carter burst out laughing immediately. I threw a rock at Dax. The rest of the afternoon passed easier than I thought possible. Like something inside me had finally unclenched. No hiding, no pretending, just happiness. Real happiness. That night was our last night at the cabin, which apparently meant everyone decided to get emotional. Bennett started talking about friendship like we were dying in war tomorrow. Miles got nostalgic over college memories. Dax somehow managed to cry laughing and actually cry within the same hour. We ended up around the fire outside one last time while cold air rolled through the trees around us. Carter sat beside me wrapped in a blanket, shoulder pressed against mine. At one point, his hand found mine under the blanket quietly. Nobody commented anymore. It already felt normal to everyone. And honestly, that felt kind of incredible. Later, after Bennett finally passed out again and Dax disappeared inside for snacks, the group got quieter. Beckett looked across the fire at me and Carter. "You know," he said calmly, "this whole thing makes way more sense now." Carter laughed softly. "We weren't subtle, huh?" Beckett stared at both of us for a full second. You looked at each other like divorced people reconnecting at a funeral. I almost choked laughing. Miles pointed aggressively. "That's exactly it." Carter buried his face into my shoulder, groaning while everyone laughed. But underneath the embarrassment, I could feel him smiling. Eventually, the fire burned lower. One by one, everyone drifted inside until only me and Carter remained outside alone. The forest had gone quiet. Just wind moving softly through trees and the crackling remains of the fire. Carter stared into the flames for a while before speaking. "You scared?" I thought about it, honestly. About going home, about reality, about what this meant now. "A little," I admitted. Carter nodded slowly. "Me too." Then, after a second, "But not about us." That sentence settled deep in my chest. I looked over at him. The firelight softened everything about his face. And suddenly, I realized something terrifyingly simple. I loved him exactly like this. Not as some fantasy version in my head, not as a secret crush. This version, the real one. Carter noticed me staring again and smiled faintly. "What?" I shook my head slowly. "Nothing." But he kept looking at me like he knew better. Then quietly, "Come here." I moved closer instantly. Carter wrapped the blanket around both of us before kissing me slowly beside the dying fire. Soft, warm, certain. No panic anymore, no confusion, just us. And honestly, after years of wanting him, that feeling almost overwhelmed me more than the kiss itself. Eventually, Carter rested his forehead against mine. You know this means Dax is never shutting up now. I laughed quietly. Worth it. Definitely worth it. And for the first time in years, I actually believed things might turn out okay. The ride home felt completely different from the drive up. Mostly because Carter kept reaching over to touch me every 5 minutes, like he physically couldn't help himself. Hand on my knee, fixing my hoodie strings, absent-mindedly playing with my fingers while Dax pretended to gag from the back seat. You two are unbearable now, Dax complained dramatically. Bennett pointed forward. I saw them smiling at each other at a gas station. That's horrifying. Miles agreed. Carter looked entirely too pleased with himself. Meanwhile, I was still trying to adjust to the fact that this was real. Every now and then, I'd glance over at him, expecting the whole thing to feel temporary somehow. But it didn't. If anything, Carter seemed more certain every hour. At one point during the drive, Dax finally fell asleep. Bennett had headphones on, and Miles was distracted watching something on his phone, which left me and Carter in rare silence. He looked over at me briefly. You okay? That question again. Always checking, always making sure. I nodded. Yeah. Then after a second, you? Carter smiled faintly. Honestly, I think I'm the happiest I've been in a long time. That hit me right in the chest, because I knew exactly what he meant. When we finally got back to the city, reality started creeping in again. Work, apartments, normal life. The cabin had felt isolated from everything else, like the outside world couldn't reach us there. But now we were back, and suddenly this wasn't just a secret little moment anymore. This was real life. Carter seemed to notice my mood shift immediately while unloading bags from the trunk. Hey, I looked up. He stepped closer, lowering his voice slightly, while the others argued nearby. You know we don't have to figure everything out immediately, right? God. How was he somehow calmer than me now? I laughed weakly. You literally had an identity crisis 48 hours ago. True. He grinned slightly. Still feels pretty obvious, though. What does? Carter looked at me for a second like the answer was simple. You. That should have been illegal to say directly to my face. Before I could answer, Dax appeared between us carrying chips. Are you flirting again? Yes. Carter answered immediately. Dax looked genuinely offended. At least hide it for my comfort. Bennett pointed at them from across the parking lot. Kiss for goodbye, Bennett. Miles sighed. But Carter was already looking at me again, and honestly, I didn't care anymore. Not about hiding, not about people noticing. So when Carter stepped closer and kissed me quickly beside the car, I kissed him back without hesitation. The reaction behind us was immediate chaos. Dax screamed. Bennett started clapping. Miles covered his face dramatically. Beckett just nodded once, like he'd completed a science experiment successfully. Carter pulled away, smiling against my mouth. That shut them up. It literally did the opposite. Worth it, though. Definitely worth it. Eventually, everyone split off toward their apartments. Dax hugged me aggressively before pointing at Carter. If you hurt him, I'll kill you. Carter blinked. You realize that threat makes no sense, right? Goodbye. Bennett hugged both of us at once for way too long. Miles warned us not to become one of those couples. Beckett paused beside me before leaving. Told you, he said simply. I rolled my eyes while he smirked faintly and walked away. Then suddenly it was just me and Carter standing beside my car. Quiet again. The city moved around us in soft evening light while either of us seemed ready to leave yet. Carter shoved his hands into his hoodie pockets. So, guess this is the part where I ask if you want to go on an actual date. My stomach flipped instantly. A real one? Yeah. He smiled nervously now, for the first time all day. Preferably one without raccoons. I laughed before stepping closer. I'd like that. Carter's entire face softened hearing it. And honestly, that expression alone made every second of confusion and fear worth it. He leaned down, kissing me one more time, slower this time, comfortable already. Easy. Then quietly against my forehead, still can't believe it was you. I looked up at him confused. What do you mean? Carter smiled weakly. The person I couldn't stop thinking about. That hit me so hard emotionally, I almost forgot how to breathe. Because for years, I thought I was carrying this thing alone. All those nights wondering if I should move on. All those moments convincing myself he could never feel the same way. Meanwhile, he'd been fighting the exact same feelings right beside me. Carter brushed his thumb lightly against my cheek. You know what the funniest part is? What? We went on this trip because Dax said we all needed a relaxing weekend. I laughed instantly. Worst relaxing weekend of my life. Seriously. But neither of us sounded upset about it. Not even close. Carter kissed my forehead once before finally stepping back toward his car. I'll text you later. You better. He smiled one last time before leaving. And as I watched him drive away, one thought kept replaying in my head over and over. I went on a cabin trip with 5 guys and 1 secret. Turns out, Carter had been hiding the exact same one.